as you turn the knob, it's like, it will be different this time. Fuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
There comes a tornado through your house.
Right. Hello, 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 and welcome to Well Shit. It really is that simple. I'm Claire.
And I'm Serena. On this podcast, we help you to understand about your 12 universal needs, why they are currently not being well met,
how to meet them in ways that work for you, and how to consistently do so in quick, easy, and simple ways that fit seamlessly into your life.
We'll also help you to understand how doing so will have a positive ripple effect in literally every area of your life.
If you like what you hear, come and join the conversation in our Facebook group.
And enjoy the show.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, everyone.
Serena for the win again today. Serena for the win. Like, you know, tell them what just happened.
I'll give myself that little toot on my own horn.
Oh, yeah.
As usual, Claire asks, are you ready? Because that's how we start our podcast before.
Because I go first, so I have to check that she's ready for me to start.
And I mean, we could just do a reel of how many times Claire said ready, and I'm like, yep. And I'm obviously not ready. And it just happened again. So Claire said ready. And I was like, yep. And I'm like, I am ready. And then I just kind of slid over just to make sure the audio was on, and it wasn't. So we did not have to grieve the loss of our audio on this one.
Which we have done many, many times.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like we're trying to be funny, but there actually is, there is a little process of grief that comes with something like
oh God, that was so good. And we won't remember some of it. And it's not, we're not being trite in that. There is like oh God, that happens in those moments, and unfortunately we've had more of them than I care to talk about. But not
me for the win today.
But Serena for the win today. And today we are talking about grief, but we're talking about it in a slightly different way, because a lot of people think that grief is just about death. As in, like, when somebody dies, that's the instance in which grief comes up. But the reality is that grief isn't just about death. It's actually also about change. So whenever we go through some kind of significant change in our lives, there is normally a grieving process that goes with that, because grief isn't about death. Grief is about loss. And what comes up is that when something is changing, in order for something to change, we have to lose what it was in order for it to become, oh, she says, hitting the sound shield, what it's going to be in the future. And so when things change significantly, we need to sometimes grieve them in order to move on. We need to grieve what we had, that we don't have anymore, what isn't, that was at one point, that it's gone from is to isn't, and what won't be in the future, and also sometimes that something that will never be a possibility again in the future. And all of those things are not necessarily, they're things that can happen in so many different areas of our lives. Someone might not have died, but your relationship with them might be fundamentally changing, or your relationship with a situation. It might be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be a friendship, it could be a family relationship, it could be in terms of where you're living, it could be in terms of the location that you're living, it could be in terms of the house that you're living. There's all these different ways in which this comes up. And I don't think that as a society and as a culture, we're very good at honoring and acknowledging the need for grief when it's not about death. A lot of the times it's like there's a compassion and an understanding around the grieving process when it's to do with a death. But when it's to do with these other processes, I think that there's maybe a lack of understanding, a lack of compassion, because often we don't allow ourselves to grieve when we are going through these situations and when we're in these moments. And what can end up happening is if we don't allow ourselves that space, we then often don't allow others that space. And it's such an important part of life. It's such an important part of processing the change that happens in life. And that can be change that we don't choose. It could be change that we do choose. It could be change that we want. It could be change that we don't want. Just because something is is overall quote unquote positive, or something that is something we believe will benefit us, or something that we want, that doesn't mean to say that because we feel good about the change that we're making, that we don't get to grieve what we're losing in order to create this change, or in order for this change to happen. So there's loads and loads of different examples of this. And some of the kind of big ones that kind of come to mind are things like when I've been working with clients who are separating, there is a grieving process around that separation, because it's like we're grieving for the relationship we once had, for the relationship that isn't currently, and the relationship that won't be in the future, and all the ideas and dreams and plans that we might have had for the future that we maybe have wanted to create. At those times, and this has happened, I mean, this is true of myself when I've gone through separations, even separations where I have been the one choosing to separate. I mean, it's more obvious that if you are not the one who has chosen the separation, if somebody else has chosen to end a relationship with you and it wasn't what you wanted, that the grief in that experience is more obvious, because it's like, oh, okay, this person has been is dealing with this because of somebody else has made the choice for them, and it's not what they wanted. But I think that often we forget that just because we know that a relationship is not going to serve us anymore, and that it's not something that we want for our future, that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a grieving process. And I mean, I went through this with my kind of previous longest term relationship, where it was an incredibly toxic relationship. It was abusive at times. And even though I was the one who chose to finally say enough is enough, we're done, in the moment in which that breakup happened, and the hours, days and weeks that followed, I remember we talked about in one of the previous grief episodes about allowing that bittersweet. I think it was the first episode, about allowing all of the emotions that are present, the ones that seem to be positive, or quote unquote positive, quote unquote negative, the ones that are more enjoyable emotions, the ones that are less comfortable emotions. And I remember in that process, it was the most honest experience I've had of going through a breakup, because I allowed everything to be present. And I was like, there was relief, and there was also grief. There was disappointment, and there was excitement. There was like sadness, and there was joy. There was resentment, and there was hope, and there were all of these things that were all present as part of that. And part of it was grieving. Sometimes when we're talking about relationships, and this can be intimate relationships, friendships, family relationships, sometimes we're grieving what the relationship never was, what we hoped the relationship would be. Because when you first start, especially in an intimate relationship and also in a friendship, like when you first meet and you're in that space, you have this idea of what you would like this relationship to be. And maybe it never became that. Maybe you're not actually grieving for what it was and what it isn't going to be in the future. Maybe you're grieving for the fact that it was never what you wanted it to be. And you're still letting go of this idea, the losses of the idea of what the relationship could have been, rather than what the relationship actually was. I felt like you were going to jump in there.
I was, and I lost my train of thought real quickly there. I'm like, oh, good, I lost it before she stopped talking. Oh, she saw my face.
That's the problem. I can read you a little too well.
I agree. This isn't just romantic relationships. Yeah. And I think it's easy to kind of like target grief, death. And then we talk about relationships. We're talking romantic, significant others. And this is any type of relationship. And I did remember what I was going to say. A lot of times when it comes to and I forgot again. You see how this happens? Like, yeah.
You were talking about not just being intimate relationships. It can be family, friends.
Mm-hmm. And you had been saying something before that. Oh, my. Oh, the surprise that a relationship wasn't what you expected it to be. I think that's one of the big ones. Like, you know, there's a lot of times you can kind of see it coming. Like, you're like, all right, this isn't quite working anymore. The worst, maybe not, well, I think one of the worst.
In your experience.
In my experience, one of the worst grieving processes is when it's a surprise. And that's, I mean, I think that's in wholeness, death, loss, otherwise. But if you think your relationship is one way and then all of a sudden you find out, I've had family relationships. There are certain people who I just don't communicate with anymore because I realized it wasn't healthy for me. And it's like, I realized that relationship probably was never healthy, but I didn't realize it until after that point. And it's like, oh shit, this wasn't even what I thought it was. And there's
constructive/supportive. You said healthy.
Oh, yes.
We're shifting,
thank you.
Shifting from ableist language, but you were in flow. I didn't want to jump in the middle. We're both trying to switch our language, and I'm trying to do it as well, which is why I pointed it out. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that when you believe it's one thing, and then you find out that from a long time previous, like it's not been that thing that you thought it was. So it's not just that you've lost this relationship or the idea of the relationship. That period of time that you believed was one thing, that has been lost. You've lost what you experienced because what you experienced wasn't the reality. And I think that's a big thing with this, which is like recognizing that, hold on a second, the shock is another loss on top of, because the loss is on what you actually had experienced as one thing to then discover it was something very different. And I mean, this is something I've experienced innumerable times, unfortunately, in my life, where I've gone through these heartbreaks, but not just in a romantic sense, also in a friendship sense, and a familial sense as well. Like I remember I've had several very close female friends in adult life. I mean, friendships kind of meander a little when we're younger, but I think you get to a certain point in adulthood where you expect people to operate in a different way because we're adults now,
like an adult.
Children, like an adult. It's like we're beyond the age of 25. Our brains are fully developed. How about we act like it?
How dare you suggest adults act like adults?
Well, and the reality is the reason that adults don't act like adults is because their needs are unmet and they're relating to their needs the way they would. The way that children would. We've discussed this on previous episodes. So I understand logically why this happens, but there have been times I remember having a very close relationship with a friend who all of a sudden, basically what happened was she was. It was a messy situation. It was in a work environment, and she had a boyfriend and was also messing around with somebody that we worked with. And I knew about this. I didn't agree with it, but I did know about it. I found she called me, or she texted me one day, and she was like, "Did you know that this other person was going on a date?" And it was one of the things that, like, my immediate reaction was, "Oh my God, no, really? What?" And then because we worked in like an open plan office, I remember like it like triggered a memory of like when I'd obviously been working on something. I wasn't paying attention to the conversation, but I must have overheard a conversation that somebody else was having. And I was like almost ready to send the message and then hit delete. And then I was like, actually, now you say it, I do remember hearing something. I didn't register it at the time, but I've only just, and this person just went for the jugular. She thought I had betrayed her. And I was like, I didn't even remember this until you just sent me this message. And not only that, but took the vulnerabilities that I'd shared with her as a friend and used them and weaponized them against me. And that was like, it was like a double hit of like, not only was this friendship not what I thought it was in terms of a safe space and someone who I could rely on and trust, and we were going to be like long friends into the future, but in actual fact, this was somebody who took, who would, I mean, even if I found out that I wasn't going to be, if I'd been friends with somebody, it wasn't going to work, I would never try to hurt them. That's just not how I am as a person. And this was a case of a hurt person wanting to hurt people. She believed I'd hurt her and she wanted to hurt me back, and she knew exactly how to do it, and that's what she did. So it was like grieving for not only the relationship, but for who I thought she was, because that's not who I believed her to be. And that's, I mean, it was like grief on grief on grief on grief. And it happened like good, I mean, there's at least 3 times I can think about like adult friendships where that's happened. And the same thing with familial relationships. I've shared about the relationship with my grandfather on a previous episode and the journey I went through with him, and like who I thought he was as a person, because he was who my grandmother had built him up to be. And who he was in reality were 2 different people. And I was in a relationship with the person I thought he was. And then all of a sudden I found out who he actually was. And I've got huge compassion for him, because he was a product of his needs and his upbringing and all those sorts of things, and how everybody related to him in his life. And still, he was not the person I thought him to be. And there was a grieving process, because I thought we had this amazingly close relationship. And it turned out he was somebody entirely different to who I thought he was, which meant that the relationship we had didn't exist, because I was in a relationship with a fantasy, not with the reality of who he actually was. And as I said, while I understand why he was the way that he was, he did some things that were pretty unkind, and that was not what I wanted in this kind of relationship. So I made a choice to change the relationship. But just because it was my choice to change the relationship doesn't mean to say I didn't grieve for what I thought we had, what I wish we could have had in the moment, and what we were never going to have in the future.
I saw something on Facebook the other day, and I actually copied it and popped it into our show notes here. So I'm going to read from it, because I could reword this. It's not a direct quote from anybody, but I think it's really important. It resonated right away. Mm-hmm. And it's, everybody talks about cutting people off, but nobody really talks about the grief that comes with having to stand firm on that decision, knowing it's not what you wanted, but what was necessary for your well-being. And I think that's really, really, really important, because there is a grief process in every time you have to hold that boundary too.
Yes.
Because when that boundary, if, you know, we've talked about you know me, I talk about boundaries as much as possible, but in our boundaries episode, we talk about the street, the sidewalk, mm-hmm. the gate, the door, and all the different things. And once somebody comes up to whatever boundary you have to hold, you're going to get that kind of feeling of the grief going through, like, all right, no, I processed this to put this boundary in place, and now you're back. So now I need to process the fact that you're back and that all this isn't going to happen again, or right. all this did happen, or whatever part you're grieving. There's a continual process in that we need to be aware of, and you need to really give yourself some compassion and kindness. And when you feel that come up, like it may show up as anger, it may show up as frustration, it may show up as like sadness. It could show up. I mean, it could show up. It could show up as happiness. You're like, oh, the person's back, but no, I don't want that. Like it could show up in a lot of different ways. And just realizing, like, okay, there is a process. Every time I have to hold my boundary with this person, I am grieving a little bit for the loss of what was before that boundary was set. Right. Prior to it needing to be set.
Well, and also for what you wish it were in that moment. So like using the analogy that we talk about in the boundaries episode, where it's like the door, the gate, the road, the sidewalk, the street. If you imagine you have somebody who you wish you could have in your home, if you wish you had the relationship with them, that having them in your home would feel good and would feel connected and would feel comfortable and safe. If they're stood at your front gate and you're having to say, I'm sorry, you don't get to come in the front gate, that part of your heart that kind of goes, oh God, I wish that I had that relationship where you could come in and hang out on my couch and we could just enjoy our time together. I mean, we talked about it in terms of I think it was the last episode of the grief series, where we were talking about like honoring who somebody is when they're no longer here anymore. And like my grandmother, I wished that I could have had that relationship where I could have talked to her and asked for her advice. And the reality is I would never have asked for her advice, because who she was as a person was so diametrically opposed to that's not true. The advice she would have given is advice I never would have wanted to follow, because it's like we were just so fundamentally different people. And I could still grieve for the fact that I didn't have a grandmother I could go to for advice, while honoring the fact that I'm not going to ask advice from somebody who is probably going to steer me in a way that doesn't feel good for me. And I think that's that thing, is like every time you put that boundary up, you're reminded of the fact that they're almost certainly never going to be allowed through your front door. And you wish you had the relationship with them where they could be allowed through your front door.
I've had this situation with having to set boundaries with friends that I've had to unfortunately cut out of my life because of how they were compromising my needs. And every so often they'll come back and it's like, oh, like, and then like, no, I remember why I set this boundary. And then it's like, I wish we could just be friends. Like, right. And then there's a grief because, okay, they came to the door and I'm like, oh, well, I remember when you used to come to the door and I got excited and now you come to the door and I'm hiding behind a couch. And I'm like, hopefully they don't know I'm home.
Right.
But then there's the part of me that's like, again, grieving what could have been, what should have been in a perfect world, or why is it so hard to just be friends, like, and be in cohesive relationship? Like, why do we have to compromise each other? You know, it's
right. And so often it's layered. And so often it's their unmet needs that are causing them to behave in ways that impact your needs negatively. And I mean, I've had this with a number of friends, and some really difficult friendships to complete on, where people who were very, very close to me, who I dearly loved and would have loved, I expected to be a part of my life ad infinitum. And it's difficult to say, actually, I need to set a boundary right now because how this is working isn't working for me. And it's so tempting to be like, because we have such a strong connection to what we wanted it to be, or the possibility it could be, is to allow them through the front door again and be like, oh shit, now there's a mess everywhere, I gotta clean up again. This is why I didn't know. And
well, as you turn the knob, it's like, it will be different this time. Fuck.
Yeah.
Here comes a tornado through your house.
Right. And it's like, and it might be an emotional tornado where it's like they leave and you're like, whoa, I got to take a couple of days to get myself back, or I don't have the capacity to deal with the tornado right now. I'm going to go hide in the bathroom till it goes. Like, I mean, there's a number of different ways in which it shows up, and you can still grieve like that. And in some respects, it can be harder to grieve for somebody who is still living than it is to grieve for somebody who has passed.
And something that just kind of resonated with me, you know, we talked about in the last episode, and Claire just mentioned about identifying with who the person really was, especially when it's somebody that's still present and alive.
Yeah.
Remembering, like, okay, I've set a boundary and I've had to cut this person out because, you know, they compromise my needs. There's still love. And grieving with the fact that you're dealing with the fact that there's still love. There's still a desire for friendship. There's still all these things that make it, like, that could, big air quotes, could work. Chances are they wouldn't work. But, like, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, it's interesting because I think one of the things that can happen within this is the change coming from having people change throughout life. So it's like when you first meet, I had someone describe this to me this way many years ago, and it really resonated with me. It was actually regarding me and my ex, was like this person met this person, but this person, i.e. me, had changed. Like, this person doesn't exist anymore. If you're watching on the, I'm gonna do it this way because it looks a little bit better visually. If you're watching on the podcast, you'll see what I'm doing. So this person met and they formed a relationship. This person now changed. Well, this person doesn't exist anymore. This relationship is no longer an option because this person doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of the time, this person and this person, that relationship isn't going to work because there's been they've changed to the extent where they're no longer in alignment with each other for that kind of relationship. Now, if this person decides they want to go on their own development journey and they end up sort of here, you can see whether there's a possibility of this person being in a relationship, or you can see, is there a possibility of this person and this person being in a relationship? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's like recognizing that sometimes a change can be, I've lost a relationship because I've changed to the point where no longer do the crossovers in terms of beliefs and values and desires for this relationship line up anymore. And again, it's like, I don't regret the changes that I have gone through, because they're all changes that I've wanted to make to myself to be the person I am now. I mean, look at the needs process. Like, I would never want to unlearn the needs process and the needs work, because that's what's made me more resilient, more nourished, more supported, more fulfilled. And still, I can still be sad for the fact that my now being in this place has meant that this person and I are no longer in alignment for that kind of relationship. Now, it may be that what you can do is you can go and process and disentangle the relationship that was. So maybe it was a romantic relationship, and you go and you heal from that romantic relationship being no longer like completing basically, and no longer existing in that same form. And once you go and you do the healing and you kind of disentangle all the attachments and entanglements that are there as part of that, and become whole independent human beings, like, again, independent of each other. Now at that point, you may be able to maybe that you'd actually decide to start a friendship, and it may be that a friendship is it's a different relationship to the one you had wanted and intended, but you have to go through that grieving process for what the relationship was, and you have to go through that grieving process as if it will never be that ever again, and that a lot of the time you have to go through it as if that person will not be in your life ever again, in order to fully heal and process that grief, to then be at the point where it's like, okay, now we're at this point where we're both healed from that relationship. Does it actually serve us? Would we like to be friends? Does it serve us to be friends? You can then explore different kinds of relationships, but you have to go through the grieving process for the relationship that was, in order to allow for the possibility of what a relationship could be in the future. So there's a number of different examples of this. There's another example that comes up with a lot of like parents' expectations of children and what the children's lives will be. So there's a number of different ways this plays out. So for example, it may be if a parent has an expectation that a child will be a doctor, lawyer, whatever, and instead they decide they want to be a dancer or a musician or an artist of some description. Like, there can be a process. Now, again, what's happening in this situation is the parent normally is having expectations of the child to meet the parent's needs, or because of what the parent believes will meet the child's needs best. Not actually what meets the child's needs best, but that's normally what's happening in that scenario.
And a layer also of conditioning.
Yes, that as well. And the conditioning is often what leads to the belief that that's what will meet the child's needs best. Is that in that situation, a lot of the time there is a little bit of a grieving process that needs to go through. Like the life that I believed my child would have is going to be different from the life that my child actually has. That's my stuff. It's not about my child. It's not their grief. But I sometimes am going to grieve for what I expected their life to look like, or the relationship that I was going to have. Another example is like for children who choose not to get married, for example. And it's like, actually, this is a choice that's right for them, but I had these ideas in my head about how their wedding would be, or giving them away, and all those sorts of things. And a lot of the time you need to grieve for that and allow yourself to process about that that's not going to happen. And it's okay that you feel sad about the fact that it's not going to be the way that you expected it to be, because with expectation, if the expectation doesn't match the reality, there's a loss in that. Now, the loss might be the expectation might have been an unreasonable expectation. We're not saying that the expectation was okay or good or even supportive to everybody, but if we did have an idea about how we thought things were going to be, and then the reality is something very different, then we want to go through our process of grieving the fact that our our reality is not going to be the way that we expect it to be. Same thing with having grandchildren, like with our if our children decide not to have children, we've got this idea about what it is that we expect in terms of our future. And that's because we put our expectations of the things that we expected or the conditioning or we would have liked onto our children. And it's okay that we feel a sense of loss that that's not going to be present. It's not our place to put that onto them because they have to do what's going to meet their needs. What we instead have to do is we have to honor the fact that we are feeling a sense of loss around it and process that loss so that we're not holding on to that.
In remembering that it doesn't have to be something, significant, big, or like, I mean, as Claire's talking about like these kind of life events, like getting married and having kids, like that's something that you hear when you get to a certain age. It's like you kind of have this, societal conditioning and that this is what it looks like. And then you kind of set up your life as a child. You're like, and this is what it's going to look like when I'm an adult. If there are any kids listening, whatever you think it's going to look like, probably not.
Yeah. Like, true story.
Surprise.
Spoiler alert.
Even the simplest things, though, and what's coming to my mind right now isn't even as simple as it could be. But let's say you have a child. Like my mom was a dancer. Mm-hmm. My mom probably wanted me to be a dancer because that was what she knew. She knew it fulfilled her. I ended up being a dancer. Mm-hmm. However, if I got to that first dance class and I was horrible or I hated it or whatever those things were, she probably would have had some sort of feelings about that. Right. And I don't believe she would have identified with it at the time, but one of those feelings probably would have been grief. Yeah. The grief that I'm not going to be able to pass this on, that she's not going to be able to have the memories I had with dancing or all of that. Like, noting that those little things that can happen, if you feel grief, it means it needs to be processed. Like, if you feel it, because that's how you're going to process through it and come out on the other side and be like, all right, that's fine. She's not a dancer, but look at her go making spaghetti art, like whatever it is. If you process through the feeling when you
spaghetti art,
absolutely. Then we'll throw it on the wall and see what sticks. God, that could be a really cool art form. Wet paint and noodles.
Oh yeah,
like we could literally throw spaghetti on the wall.
Oh, I want to do that. Yeah, we're gonna do that. It's gonna happen. Watch this space if we remember.
We know how that goes. But I wanted to really kind of note that because I think it's so easy to think of big things or huge changes or like these life-changing events. Like sometimes it's, I thought I was going to get a package and the package isn't here. Like, and it's like, oh, wait, but that was supposed to be here and that was meant to be for this and this and this. And it's like, if there's, not saying that grief comes up in that or like something like a package is lost, like, grieve it.
Well, and the thing about it is that it's a little bit like grief tends to come up in a response to trauma, and as we've said, like the traumas can be slight, significant, or severe, and they can be either momentary or a sustained period of time. The example that kind of comes to my mind was my last Celebrate Being Alive day here in Key West. We wanted to go out on the boat and have a day hanging in the ocean because that's my happy place. Like I love doing that. And we got on the dock, we got in the boat and it was like, okay, a little bit rainy, but we know what weather's like here. I mean, it can be pouring on one side of the street and bone dry on the other side of the street. So, I mean, the fact that it's literally, so the fact that it's raining here doesn't mean to say that, like normally we could ride out in the boat and get out beyond the rain, the rain or the wet or the wane as it turns out to be. So sorry, I had a stupid Christmas joke just pop into my head for a second there. Okay, I'm going to tell it just because it's come up now because I got to share it. So there was somebody I know who was it was a kind of religiously based joke, and this person had gone into like an elementary school, like a primary school, and said like it was just in the lead up to Christmas, and it was like. They were talking about like the fact that Christmas was coming, and he was like, "Oh, so who is it? Whose birthday is it that's coming up?" One little boy put his hand up and said, "Wayne," and he was like, "Wayne?" He was like, "What do you mean no, it's not Wayne, it's Jesus. He said, no, it's Wayne. He was like, what do you mean it's Wayne? He said, we sing about it every year, a Wayne in a manger. Do you have the song, A Wayne in a Manger, over here?
I know what song you're talking about.
Yeah, a Wayne in a manger. So that's what the Wayne would say. Like, I'm like, I have to say that because otherwise it's just like going to hang around, especially because I got Christmas decorations behind me. Anyway, so I wanted to go out and I thought we'd be able to get out ahead of the rain into the sandbar or down to one of the places that we go. And we got out there and once the boat started going, it got wet. Mm-hmm. It was coming down in sheets, like to the extent where when you're out on a boat in that, it's painful mm-hmm. because this stuff is hitting you at a rate of knots. I mean, literally a rate of knots. Like that's literally where knots came from. And I remember looking at Joe, Serena's husband, who's the kind of captain, and he knows the weather and everything. And he's looking at, and I was like, if it doesn't work, if it's not gonna be enjoyable for us to go out, I would far rather go back, get changed, and go for a nice brunch together. Like it's okay if that's the case. And he was like, he said, I don't think we're going to get around this. And I said it's okay, and it was okay. And there was a little part of me that was like that grieved for the like a teeny grief around the experience that we would have had if we'd gone out. And we had a great day. We had a great experience. We had a yummy brunch. We went wandering and went and bought crystals and ended up we did all kinds of things. And there was a part of me that like felt sad because of what we would have had if the weather had been nice. And when it wasn't something I was grieving that was actually going to happen because it wasn't a choice. Like, yeah, we could go sit in the sandbar in the pouring rain and the freezing cold, dodging like lightning bolts. Like, that's not fun. But in my head, what I had imagined and expected for that day looked different to how it was. And there was a little tiny part of me that was like, oh, I felt a little bit sad about that. And it's okay. That's like a little tiny grief. That's like a
grieflet.
It's a grieflet.
It's a grieflet.
It's a grieflet. And it's okay to allow yourself to feel that in those moments. There are some other big significant ones. And so it's like, and this can happen with all of these types of changes, like with the tiny little ones and the big ones and everything in between. I know that you went through this when your childhood home was sold, right?
Yeah. I grew up in the same house. Always lived in the same house, never moved. Well, I moved into the basement of said house when I was in junior high. It was always the house I went back to, like I'd come home from college. It was my grandmother's house. We lived in an in-law apartment that was attached to the house. Interesting living situation. And it was always, I was going to go to college, and eventually somehow, some way, I'd say until about 5 years, between 5 and 10 years ago, let's say, mm-hmm. I realized that I would not be moving back to my childhood home, back to my hometown and doing that. There just wasn't anything there for me. And that's, yeah. I mean, plain and simple, like I could have had the childhood home and essentially nothing else that I wanted in my life. Mm-hmm. And I inherited the house, and I was really eager to sell it. Like, yeah. But I mean, I've known for years that I was like, you know what, I actually, I asked for the house, and I was mm-hmm. like, these are my childhood memories. This is all of my like life up to this point. This house signified a lot of it. Yeah. And I realized there was some grief in the process of selling my house. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, I want to sell this house. Like, I do not want to be a homeowner. I do not want to have a house a million miles away from me, somewhere that I don't plan on going to visit very often, if at all. And it's like, what is this feeling? And it was actually grief. And it was the grief of the life that I imagined as a child. Mm-hmm. It was the grief of the fact that, okay, this is no longer going to be our family home. Like, this will be somebody else's home, and they'll make it into whatever they make it into. And it was weird to have that element of grief there, because I'm like, no, I want that. Like, I do not want this house. I do not want to deal with this. this is a choice I'm making, yet I was sad about it.
Right. Well, and it's interesting, like there was actually another element of grief that came up for you around that, which was that grief of it always being like, it was always the home base to return to.
Oh, yeah.
No matter where you, because as like we're both travelers, like having that home base that you would always return back to no matter what, and that no longer being that for you, that was a big deal, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there was, definitely my survival needs were coming up in that because that's an element of security, knowing that no matter the shit hits the fan, no matter what happens, like, okay, I can go back there, and now I don't have that anymore. And it's different. It's not bad.
You've created different ways of getting that security need met that are not, but they're not the way you expected it to be met.
Right. And there was a process of being like, okay, this is what I expected. This is what it's going to be. And this is okay. And, this isn't going to be. So let's like deal with that shit.
I'm having some feelings about it. I mean, I remember the conversations that you and I had during that process where it was like, this is, I'm having some feelings about this. And I'm like, okay, have the feelings. That's good.
I'm so glad I'm selling this house. Why am I crying?
Well, and it's funny because I had a very similar situation. Like we both had very tight-knit families when we were growing up. And while I didn't live in my grandparents' house, my grandparents' house on my mother's side was like the hub of the family. Like all the family used to gather there regularly. It's where like we had family parties and all that sort of stuff. As I was growing up, I had like memories with, at one point my cousins were more like brothers and sisters than they were cousins. Like it was a home that held a lot of happy memories for me. And for the longest time, I thought like my plan had been I was going to, same as Serena, go off to college, just find a person, decide to hook up with them and get hitched and have babies and all that sort of stuff. And my plan had been, I wanted to raise my family in that house because that was the family house. And it was the house that was so many Christmases and so many like family. I remember walking through the front door every time we lived about an hour and a half away, and we would often go up for the weekend, and we would get there on a Friday night. And I remember my grandmother greeting us with a Pyrex of macaroni cheese, like every Friday night. That was like, and it was like you'd smell it as you walked in the house, and it was like that was home. And it was interesting because there was a long time between this realization and where I got to in the last couple of years. I knew that, I mean, for the longest time, I knew I wasn't going to live in that house. Like I knew that wasn't my future. I knew it wasn't where I wanted to live. I knew that I wanted to travel, and for some time, obviously in the process of the visa process right now, like the intention is I would love to be able to be based over here. And the interesting thing is, in the last 2 years, that house was sold from my family. And I still had feelings about it because it was like all the time it was still part of the family. There was still this like vague possibility, no matter how remote, no matter the fact that I didn't want it anymore, it still was a possibility. And the second it was sold, that was no longer a possibility. Even though it wasn't the possibility I wanted anymore, I still had the grief around letting go of that idea. And it's interesting because I remember having a conversation with an ex of mine years ago about where to live, because have always been a very family centric person. And it was the time when I was house sitting and traveling the world and living in all these different locations. I remember a conversation that we had where he'd said to me, oh, he thought that I wanted to travel, and then when I got married and had kids, I would want to be based in the UK, like near my family. And I was like, what would make you think that? Like my ideal situation would be to be on a desert island or tropical island as such with all my family and all my friends. But that's not a possibility. Like that's not a reality. So I would actually far rather, like I want the traveling more than I want like that I want to be in this kind of location. That's what's going to make me happiest, I know. I'm still sad for the fact that I'm not going to live by my family. I still get to grieve that thing, even though, and I mean, as a traveler, I'll be back and forth all the time. That's how I want to live, is I want to be able to go and visit family. But I can still grieve for the fact that I'm not going to be near them in the same way as, like, I don't get to see my niece and nephews as regularly as I would like to. And that's okay, because this is what I've chosen, and I still get to grieve that. Even though there are choices that we made, I think that the key thing is that just because you've chosen the change doesn't mean that you can't grieve it. And then there's other things that are like completely out of our control. So like having a traumatic injury or having a life-changing diagnosis. There is a grief process around what we expect our future to look like. And what we believe we're going to create in our future, and that's based on a certain set of understandings. And if life comes along and changes those parameters, all of a sudden what's possible in our future changes. And I think that that's the thing, is that no matter whether we're talking about like a diagnosis, whether we're talking about a relationship change, whether we're talking about a house being blown down by a hurricane, whether we're talking about not being able to go out on the boat because it's raining on a particular day, like all of these.
Leaving a job.
Yeah.
There's a lot of grief in that.
Yeah.
I mean, I had that when I left my most recent position to come full-time with the universal needs. I was ready. I was beyond ready. It was something that
she'd been ready for nearly 2 years.
It's something that probably should have been done a long time before, but for my own reasons, I had stayed until the point that I did, and I was ready to be like, done, here, go. And
bye.
And I found myself like grieving. I was like, I'm not going to go into work every day. Okay, I'm not going to see these people every day. Okay, those things that I did really enjoy, like that's going to be different now. And it's, you know, for something that I was so anxious, I was so excited to come full time to, you know, our work. And there was so much good that I was like, so much better for myself that I was choosing in this decision.
Yeah.
But there was still something I was going to miss. There was still something. There was still a loss of what my life had been for the last, 4 years.
Right. Well, I think it's that, and it reminds me, there's an episode of, I think it's How I Met Your Mother. It's been a while since I saw it, where they talk about, I can't remember how they phrase it, but it's like the rose tinted glasses. It's like you can want something a lot, and then the second that actually it's happening, you see all the things that were good about it, and those are the things that you end up grieving. And it's okay to grieve those things. It's like, oh, there's a part of you like, oh, I don't want to leave it because so and so and this and that, and I've got all these things. And this is one of those situations where it's really important. This is why when we go back to the episode 1 on how to grieve, it's important to honor all of the feelings that are present and recognizing that it's okay to grieve things and still be excited about the things that you're excited about. It's okay to grieve a situation and feel hopeful or feel relief about the fact that something is changing. It's okay if you don't feel hopeful and relief because the change wasn't your decision and you're just grieving for the things that aren't going to be that you and it's okay if at some point those things that you were grieving are actually things now you are grateful for that happened because you're in a different position that would never have happened had that situation never occurred. And it's okay if you get to the point where you never get to that point where it's like, actually that was just a sucky thing that I went through in my life that was sad and difficult, and I went through it and I processed it and I'm now here on the other side of it. All of those different variations and every other possibility, every other permutation of that is okay. And so it's about recognizing that it's the most important thing with this is to allow yourself to grieve when we're going through these moments of change. And if it's a grieflet, yeah. If it's a grieflet, that moment might be like literally just a couple of seconds where it's like, oh, I feel sad for a second and now I'm moving on to the next thing. And if it's something more involved than that, it might be a little bit more. You might have a conversation with someone for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It may take you days, weeks, months to grieve it. You're going to go through that process with if it's something a bigger deal where you might go through that open water experience that we were talking about in the previous episode where it's like, oh God, I'm not trying to gasp for breath, and then another wave comes over, and like it's okay. Wherever you're at with it is okay. The most important thing is to really allow yourself to be in the process, to feel what is coming up as it is coming up, and to move through it as that's happening.
One thing I want to say with the grieflet, there's a lot of times in the past where I would have judged myself for grieving something small, spilled milk. I really wanted
insignificance.
Yeah, like I'm going to go with don't cry over spilled milk. You have a glass of tall milk, you have a plate of cookies, and you were so excited about this cookies and milk, and it was the last, like you don't have any more milk. Or you could have an entire gallon in the refrigerator. You tip it over.
Aww.
Grieflet.
Yeah. Right.
Like that's that is a grieflet.
Yeah.
Now, bear with me on this one. You don't process this little grieflet. Like you're upset, you're niggled by it, you're whatever, but you're like, well, now this experience with the cookies, you either have to clean up. Like my experience with this plate of cookies is different. No matter what happens, whether I get more milk or not, like the experience I had planned is no longer. Yeah. Like it's gonna look different here. I've had it happen in the past where a grieflet that I have not processed in the moment has come up rogue like weeks later, and then I'm literally crying over the spilled milk with my cookies 2 weeks ago because some asshole cut me off at the light. Like it's happened, and it's like it's really important to remember that even those little things, they can compound, and if like you don't process what you're feeling, eventually it's going to process it. It's going to get processed.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things is that often it's the small things that really bite us as far as this is concerned. Like we might allow ourselves some grief, and we often don't allow ourselves the full magnitude of our grief, even in the big things. But we very rarely do we allow ourselves the grief in the small things. And so all of those small things, you imagine how many of those small things there are. There's a lot more of them that are going to happen with a lot higher frequency than the big things. And when you compound and compound and compound and compound and compound and compound, it's like boom. Because finally, like all these little things that we've not allowed ourselves to acknowledge how we feel about, all of a sudden all hit at the same time. They've it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm like done. That's it. I'm over. And it might be, and it is often something small, which seems insignificant, and you're even questioning yourself, like, what the hell, why am I reacting like this? I don't understand why, because of all those little grieflets that have not been acknowledged and honored along the way. I know that we had a situation recently where all of a sudden Serena's like sobbing in tears, and she's like, I didn't even know I was feeling all this. And we've both been there. Like, this is not just her, like I've done this as well, where it's like, because we haven't acknowledged the things sometimes in the moment because we're so busy, or things are like we've got priorities and deadlines, and there's been things we haven't paused to allow ourselves to feel and acknowledge and process what's happening. And then all of a sudden,
there it is.
Boom.
Hello, did you forget about me?
Yes. Let me remind you.
And something with that too, the more you get used to, kind of with anything, the more you get used to acknowledging and processing those little grieflets, the more likely you're going to be able to process the bigger ones, I think, as well. Like the legitimate, or not, cancel, clear, delete that, not legitimate grief, but like the bigger grief instances.
Good job on the cancel, clear, delete. I like you caught that.
I caught that.
Yeah,
like, no.
Nice.
And it's kind of like meeting your needs. You know, we say start slow, start simple, and it's like you get the little, ooh, we talked about the ding ding dings in the recent episode. It's like, ooh, that feels good. Ooh, that feels good. And it's just little things, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm doing more things, and I'm doing more things, and then I feel better and better and better, and it compounds in a positive way where you're compounding your resources rather than depleting them.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to like get into the practice of being like, oh, that feels kind of sucky. Like,
and that might be it. Like, and that could be it. Like, that feels kind of sucky. That might be all that's needed.
It doesn't have to be a whole blown out like
shebang.
Tears and puddles and blow-ups.
We don't need a ticker tape parade over every little grieflet. I mean, we could do a ticker tape parade over.
I mean, if that's what served you at the time, and that's what you're feeling.
Absolutely. I think it is important to recognize that in those moments that don't get acknowledged are the things that will likely come up and boom at the end. And I think that Serena's right, that the easier you process those small things, the easier you'll process the big things, and the more permission you'll give yourself to do that as well. Like the more you'll allow yourself and be like, it's okay to do this. Like this is part of the process.
Yeah, because once you cry over spilled milk, it's easy to cry over a legitimate, or cancel, clear, delete again, a bigger loss.
Yes. Yeah.
Changing language is a bitch sometimes, but well worth it when you get into
so
the habit.
Important because, and this is the thing, is like that's exactly the reason that we don't allow ourselves to like feel and process the grieflets, because the conditioning that we have is that they're not legitimate, or that they're less legitimate or less valid or less important to process. And so that's the reason that these language changes, like you see that we're actively changing our language as we're working. So we're always working on this. We're always looking at the next thing and figuring out what the next piece of the puzzle is.
What's the new thing I'm not going to say anymore?
Yes. What's the new thing I'm going to replace? And so the reason is because every time we hear that, we reinforce that. So by saying that out loud, we're like, hold on a second, we're actually underpinning this belief that that's true, when in actual fact, all the grief you feel, all the emotions you feel are valid and are worthy of being processed. And the more we learn to process them with the small things, the easier the big things become. And so like, I'm really like, I love that you've caught yourself like both times on that, because it's true. And it's like, I see it a lot of the time with clients where they'll say something and I'm like, oh, can we tweak this to that language? Because as we do that, what we do is we change our relationship to these things in our lives, and we change the extent to which we're going to give ourselves permission to process these things. So it's like, if milk gets spilled and we want to cry, fucking do it. Like that's
if milk gets spilled and you want to dance in it and like splash around because that's what makes you feel better, like, all right, get angry at the milk or dance with the milk, like.
Yeah. And the more that the thing is, the more that we do this for ourselves and the more we allow ourselves to do this, the more we actually allow and create spaces where other people feel more comfortable. Like, I think one of the things that like Serena saw me doing it, and that kind of gave you more permission, or gave you the ability to give yourself permission to do these things more, right?
Yeah.
Because the conditioning is don't do it. The conditioning is don't cry over spilled milk. The conditioning is it's not important. Like, get over it. Like, don't like pull yourself together. Like, I'm talking about my grandmother. That was like her favorite saying.
Pull yourself together.
Pull yourself together, Peg. Like, it's like if she was like upset about anything, like, and also, I mean, you have to remember like generational thing. Like she grew up in the war, like falling apart when like it's life and death around you. That's not necessarily safe to do. So there was potentially a reason for that conditioning, which is like, pull yourself together, we've just got to get to safety, or pull yourself together, like, but she got into the habit of doing that. It's also the sort of thing my grandfather would say, pull yourself together, Peg. Like, it's like he was of a different age and a different mentality of doing things. Like, emotions were not a big thing in that house, and it's like that a lot of the time that's the conditioning. Like, pull yourself together, come on, like this is silly, this is something small, it doesn't matter. The truth is, if you're having a feeling about it, it matters, and it matters to the extent to which you're feeling it. And
a lot of times it's harder to pull yourself together than it is to just feel it, process it, and be past it. I'm not going to say done with it, because it may come back, healed for that moment in that instance. Or you can be trying to pull yourself together and get through it, and you're like, I really don't feel good about this, and I really just want to, like, I have emotions and I want to let them out. No, I'm going to pull myself together. I'm going to be strong and not.
It often takes more energy to do that.
More energy, more time, more like all of it. And
then you end up fighting it. It's like like this thing's it's like
Wayne. It's like Wayne, Manger, Wayne, Santa Wayne.
Yeah, I have no idea where you're going with this.
I did until I saw that look on your face, and I'm
like, what's this got to do with Wayne and a manger? I'm not sure.
What were you saying just before that?
I was saying about the fact that if you don't like acknowledge it, it will keep, like, it keeps popping up.
Oh, the fact that you couldn't, you had to tell the Christmas joke.
Oh,
because
yeah,
it would have kept popping up. I'm like, there was a point to me, like, bringing this
I
up.
was trying to figure out, like, were you talking about, like, when I had actually said Wayne initially was about the rain, like, and like the fact that was hurt, that hurt, or I was like, yeah, there was a number of different ways that could have gone. But yeah, it's that thing of, like, if you don't acknowledge it and deal with it, I'd have been fighting with my brain the whole time between now and the end of the episode, going, like, either trying to remember it because I think that Serena would have found it funny and I would have wanted to tell her, or just, like, trying to, like, stop distracting me. It was just easier just to say it, and then I haven't thought about it, which is why when Serena said that, I was like, wait, what?
Perfect example. I mean, it's kind of like our little friend over here that we talk about often.
A little niggle monster.
You get little squeaks now.
Yes.
I've been spoken to about hyper squeaking
right on top of the microphone.
On top of the microphone. Sorry.
A lot for extended periods of time. Like, the squeak's okay, but there was a moment I'm like, oh, if I was listening to this would not be fun.
Oh yeah, I was going at it for when I first got the niggle monster. I mean, and I found out he squeaked. But it's the same thing with clearing niggles. Like, the second you clear it, it's like, oh, okay. Like, sometimes you still remember it, and most of the time it's like, oh, that was a thing. I completely forgot about that.
Yeah. It's like, and that's the thing, is that these things, if you don't clear them, if you don't process them, it's like, do we sit in here and, like, it's like Serena's like, it'd be like this, like, hello.
It might even not be that, like, it might not even be that, you know, it's sometimes even worse.
Yeah.
If you need to be on the video, but it's like that, I'm not touching you. Like, Claire was poking me.
Yes.
You know, like, you might feel that little poking, like, oh, like, and it might even be something, it's like, it's not even touching you, but it's close. Here. It's just so close, you can't get away from it. And, like, I used to find, like, if somebody's poking me, I'm like, all right, you know, stop. But if somebody's like, I'm not touching you, I'm like, well, get the fuck away from me. Yeah. Like, it intensifies.
And the reason I often use the poking one is because initially the poke, you can, like, barely feel, it doesn't do anything. But if that kept going for, like, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months,
that shit's gonna hurt eventually.
It's gonna really hurt eventually, and that's often why I use that as an example. Like, I think I actually found a bruise when I did that. Like,
that, or you made a new one.
I actually have a bruise though, and I just happened to have found that spot to poke. But yeah, that's like it, and it's like it will. You might be able to distract yourself for a period of time, but then it's probably going to pop up, and then you're fighting with it, and it's taking energy and it's taking your attention rather than just being like, just process it so that it's done.
And the sixth time that the milk spills,
you
don't lose your shit, because you're like, all right, I know how to process this. Like, but if you haven't processed it, it's something little, and I mean, shit happens. Shit keeps happening.
It's going down.
I mean, like, it's inevitable that things are gonna continuously happen. That's life. Things continuously happen.
And so by processing these things, these little grieflets and the bigger griefs, like, as they come up, it means that you're not carrying those wounds with you that then can accidentally get triggered, and you react from the unmet wound, which is actually a series of unmet needs. So by taking that, like, by grieving, when things are coming up, you are honoring your needs in that moment. You're meeting your emotional experience expression need. You're meeting your value need. Like, I'm worthy of processing my emotions, of having my emotions. You're acknowledging how you feel. There's a whole bunch of different needs that are getting met in that grieving process. And so when you grieve, you're actually allowing yourself to meet your needs. And so your unmet needs, so the needs are met. If they're not met, the unmet needs are the ones that are going to jump up and bite you in the butt without you realizing it, because it's like, oh, I didn't realize you were ow, stop. So I think that's it for today. Anything you want to add before we finish?
I'm good.
So thank you for joining us for this series. And as I said, this series came in response to a number of different people asking us for this. So if there is anything that you want to hear about, or there's something we've spoken about in this series where it's like, oh, could you say more about that, please? Let us know. We'll add it to our list of things to record. It's a long list, but we tend to try and bump up the requests further up to the top.
Unless it's the request for the Larry episode, apparently, because we've gotten multiple of them recently, and I think
that's more of a logistics thing, I think, than anything. Like,
he has his cape.
It was more that you have to bring him with you on the day that we're going to do it. Like there's like another living sentient being that has to be here in order for that to happen. So it will happen. We'll get it. We'll get it done. We'll get it done.
And then I can start talking about part 2. Tune in next week.
And on that note, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for putting up with all the Larry references. We appreciate it. The Larry episode is coming, as is the glitter episode. We have a lot in the pipeline. But for now, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Remember, between now and next time, to take care of yourself, to stay safe, and to continue to meet your own needs. Lots of love.
Bye, friends.
That's it for today.
If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and give us a written review,
as it will help more people find us. And remember, grief isn't just about death, it's also about change. So whether it's big change or whether it's grieflets, be sure to honor yourself and your needs in the process.
Well, shit. It really is that simple.